Yo, what is up, YouTube? We're back. We're back with another one. And today we're going to be talking about, should be looking here, we're going to be talking about the levels of consciousness, as you can see by this mirror board I sort of whipped together. And I think this is a really powerful concept that has like practical implications that David R. Hawkins sort of introduces across a series of books. And I want to share it with you, sort of give you the rundown, maybe the different books that are most important and different concepts sort of traversing that are going to help us sort of understand what levels of consciousness are, how we can apply them, how we can sort of progress spiritually, if you will. And yeah, let's just jump into it. So I'm going to move myself over here so we can zoom in. So first of all, this, ignoring the things around it, is the Map of Consciousness by David R. Hawkins. And so effectively, you, right now, you're watching, you are at some level of consciousness right now. So you have a certain context that you view the world, and everything sort of arises in this consciousness, in this awareness that you seem to be framing things. And David R. Hawkins starts with this power versus force, sort of explaining this critical level above 200 and below 200. So past the level of 200, you progress into this power, which isn't like the traditional sense of power, but more life benefiting power than sort of life negating sort of forceful power. So when you're below 200, everything, you feel like a victim, you're in this survival paradigm, you're sort of succumb to your mind and body, and you don't really have that level of mastery over maybe what you're feeling. You're very identified with the body, very identified with the mind, and that's those lower levels below 200. And if you go for the name of the level, so if we ignore all this sort of other columns, if you just focus on the name of the level, then these will sort of sound like states that we experience. Possibly maybe you don't experience some of the higher ones. Obviously, like, we don't always experience ecstatic levels of peace and joy, and enlightenment may be a completely foreign concept to you. Maybe you just know it like sort of intellectually, conceptually, etc. But the point still stands that this um, is where we should start in terms of how we gauge where we are currently in our sort of personal growth, in our personal journey, how we sort of are compassionate to other people in their sort of situations, and understand where we're going next, and maybe the limits that we're going to encounter possibly, and how we transcend sort of the current level we're at, how we grow, and how we sort of invest our time and energy and intention. So I've mentioned Power vs. Force. This is a sort of main trilogy that he sort of introduces progressive, like higher levels. So the Eye of the Eye is more talking about this boundary of crossing over into 540 being quite a critical level of salvation or non-accumulation or non-resistance, and then reality and subjectivity, sort of more what like a lot of avatars would speak about. So avatar is someone who calibrates at 100, like Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, for example. And this is sort of speaking from that frame. This eye currently, all great books. I would highly recommend them, but ideally in the order. So Power vs. Force, then the Eye, then I, reality and subjectivity. But it's all for you to sort of understand where you're at, where you're going. And I just put together this quick sort of flow, how I generally sort of understand these things currently. And this probably is based on a lot of my experience and my sort of conceptual understanding. I may be conflating concepts here, but to me, like, consciousness is somewhat synonymous with this concept of like spirit and soul, where spirit would be like more of a global consciousness, and soul being more of like a localized version of consciousness, and sort of tapping into a higher level of consciousness would be tapping into like a more global spirit-based consciousness. And then you sort of discover like maybe the essence of who you are, or like the true nature, which we'll touch on in a bit. And so a lot of like meditation is sort of separating from this more egoic or form sort of side. And so this is where your conditions, your limits sort of live. And the ego is, if you're not familiar with the ego, I've got other videos on it, but if the ego is effectively an abstraction that we use to explain all of our limiting beliefs. And if you have a huge ego, you may find yourself fear-ridden, anger-ridden, sort of a lot of these lower concepts below 200. If you have quite a large, tenacious, traumatized ego, and you're not working through that, you're not sort of dissolving those beliefs, traumas, concepts, conditions, whatever you want to call them. But also, I mean, there's so many synonymous terms in these concepts, but the principles are fairly simple. And if you are dissolving your ego, you're making a process of this, like unidentifying with the energy, with the mind, the body. So energy, you can just think about like your feelings, your mind sort of thoughts, and your body like sensations. And if you're identified with these things, then those things will have lots of like influence over you, and you lose the power, the mastery over those certain things. So as soon as you have an impulse to do something, you may just act on it if you're at this level of shame, for example. Okay, so those are the levels. Roughly introduced David R. Hawkins and some of his works in explaining this. But I want to talk about some equivalent perspectives that we've sort of talked about. And so we've talked about the sort of positive and negative aspects of this. And so you can imagine it as an equation. So this hyphen in the middle is a minus sign. So your intention minus your conditions sort of equates to your level of consciousness. Your wisdom minus your karma, which is a more yogic term, would be like equivalent to your level of consciousness. And so you can see how you reduce the right side of these equations, then the positive sort of never really has to increase, because it's just like effectively the left hand side of these are all constant, they're already there, and it's just effectively removing the negative, removing the fear, the ego, the self-sabotage, the resistance, negativity, the suffering, the karma, the conditions. And I hope that makes sense, because if a spiritual concept isn't talking in these sort of terms, then it's sort of detached from truth in some sense. So every sort of spiritual concept talks around these same fundamental ideas, patterns, and like none of these are actually touching on the truth in a way. They're all like sort of they're all concepts touching around the sort of idea of truth underlying this. And so I had a big old list of some of the negative side of this equation. So I'm not going to go through all these, but if you want to pause, maybe you could like dig into some of these sort of more yogic terms, more presence or experience-based terms. Specialness is quite an interesting one that I added to this list recently. But the idea that if you remove all ideas of specialness in your mind, that could be equivalent to not having an ego, not identifying with the mind. Okay, cool. I hope this is sort of making sense so far. I'm probably going to make more like deep dive videos into some of these concepts, but this is just high level 101. Let's get these ideas out there and people can start asking questions. Okay, point 4, how to progress spiritually. So once you're like introduced to this concept, I know I was like, all right, but now how do I practically actually move up this level, move up these scales? How do I stop this maybe self-sabotage or suffering that I seem to be victim to, which is an illusion itself? And his book's on letting go, which is a very practical practice it's almost hard to call it a practice because it's sort of a skill that ends up becoming part of you if you practice it enough. So you end up being someone who lets go of things when they come up. It becomes like an automatic process, but something you have to do consciously in the short term. And the pathway of surrender. So this book talks about letting go as equivalent to surrender. And you can imagine that if you surrender all your grief, you then move to fear. You surrender all your fear, you then move to desire. You surrender all your desire, you move to anger. You surrender all your pride, you move to courage. And it's like you're just surrendering all this negative egoic programs, which is quite a simple but powerful concept that I think everyone should think about, because I've noticed this with lots of different practices recommended. If they're too like meditation focused, sometimes you're not actually processing the negative stuff. You're literally just like causing this sort of separation where you no longer care about the negative stuff because you go into like these maybe altered states of consciousness, but you never actually do the work of dissolving the stuff that is getting in the way of you like impacting the world or expressing a higher version of yourself. So you end up being more skilled at separating from this suffering, but not actually removing that suffering. And in a way, all of these ways to remove suffering is confronting it, is experiencing it, is facing it, is having that like level of courage over fear and that compassion towards it. And that could be equivalent to surrender in this sense. But this effectively covers each of these levels and what would be required to let go of all of these. He also has another book called Transcending the Levels of Consciousness, which is also exactly what's required for each level. Yeah, and so once we have that, we're probably already progressing. We learn to let go. We're sort of encountering these different like disturbances or feelings or emotions, however you sort of conceptually understand it. You're being present and you're learning mindfulness, you're learning meditation, and you're effectively overcoming your limits. So, and discovery of the presence of God, like lots of people have a reaction when they hear the word God, but devotional non-duality is also in the same sense what he's talking about here. So understanding that there's maybe this like spirit or global consciousness that, yeah, I think it's one you have to read for yourself and sort of come to your own conclusions. But if you have a great committed intention to surrender, devote, and overcome your limits, to discover your true nature, you would end up coming to your own conclusions because you can verify things experientially. You can verify things as like love is more fundamental than fear. Fear is just an illusion. Things like that. So you will end up having your own revelations, your own conclusions with all these things. And I would recommend these two if you want to sort of practically have the philosophy backing it and also the practice that is going to help you cut through all the noise. And effectively, if you have letting go, it's obviously good to explore the practices and sort of, follow your curiosities, but letting go has been probably the most valuable tool in my spiritual toolbox, if you will. And yeah, that should pretty much get you started on progressing. 5. So this is more zooming out, looking at maybe not you now, but more the global picture, maybe what the average looks like, and different patterns with the scale itself, and sort of maybe its flaws or things it's hiding in terms of complexity. So what is the path like? Generally, one thing comes up at a time, and maybe this one thing could be one sort of limit, and that life sort of has a way of confronting you exactly with what you need to work on next. And you end up processing this. It may be challenging at first. You may have to frame, recontextualize sort of how you're viewing a situation. You may have to experience something that you're not familiar with. You may have to surrender a new depth. And so that's what the path looks like. It's sort of this ebb and flow of disturbance coming up, negative condition coming up, program, and you don't always have to rationalize it. Lots of people get in this like self-analysis, need to find the root cause, and that can be useful, but past a certain point it's all sort of intention and energy based, and you can't really put a label on it. And so it is more of a intuitive letting go and an energetic letting go, like past a certain point. And yeah, it's important to know that. I just wanted to mention that one thing at a time may not be making sense in language, and that's fine. It's important to have that level of acceptance. And funny point here is that the average progress in a lifetime is 5 to 6 points, and I found that quite interesting. So that's not even enough to sort of get out of any level. So most people are like born at a level, certain amount of karma, and they generally don't move level. But that is not the case probably if you're watching this video, if you're sort of devoted to the spiritual path, you want to get better, maybe you are into self-improvement, and now you're in the depths of reading David R. Hawkins and meditation and yoga and all of that stuff. You probably would expect more significant jumps. Obviously people go from levels like 200 and then become a complete renunciant and become a monk somewhere in the mountains and become enlightened. So that would be a huge jump, like 800 points. And I think it's also important to mention at this time that even reading these books here naturally increases. So he even states that reading each of these books will give you a jump of like 10 to 50 points depending on where you're at. And I mean, that's pretty cool. So that's being like exposed to a level of truth that sort of has its own energy in response to your consciousness and will sort of elevate your own consciousness, which is pretty fascinating and cool. So yeah, reading high vibe books like these will increase your consciousness. And go into more of a collective frame. So we look at, I'm just going to talk on the evolution of consciousness. So it's mentioned here that this percentage of elapsed time, this actual graph I think is more referencing like 1990s, and so this is like the 1970s I believe, where we had this like significant jump to 207 in terms of the collective level of consciousness. So if you take the average, which is interesting how it's calculated because this isn't a linear scale. So even though the average when this was done was 207, 85% of the world's population was below 200 and 15% were above 200, which is fairly interesting. I think those numbers have changed slightly. We have the total score of humanity currently is 218, so it's jumped from 207 to 218 in that time. And yeah, this is sort of how he explains content, field, and context. I'm not going to dig into this much, but you could think of content as equivalent to the ego, thoughts, feelings, all the things we've talked about, and moving to a level of context being something like consciousness, and infinite context being the more global consciousness we've been talking about, more inclusive. And what was the last one here? So yeah, this is just explaining the log. So the way that you see that 15% outweighs 85% is because even though it looks linear on the 0 to 1000, he's actually abstracted away a lot of power, so in microwatts. So effectively, the level of consciousness seems to go up linearly, but each point you're going up is actually a more significant jump in energy the higher up you go. I hope that makes sense, but you can sort of see from the graph, if you were at 400, you're here, you go up to 500, that's like a fairly significant jump in watts, because this graph is also going up from like minus 750 to minus 35, so you can see this sort of exponent, mega jumps, and higher levels will be far more significant. Mega, it's not really a word, is it? Big, large jumps. And yeah, so we've gone over humanity over time. That was this graph. And it's quite significant that humanity in like the 1970s went over the level of 200. So into that level of courage and power and integrity and truth and all of this. Obviously, it varies probably by geography and the percentage of, enlightened beings or close to or across the world is probably distributed in a certain way. And you mentioned the log, and someone at 800 could cancel out millions of people below 200. So spiritual work, you could conclude that is the most valuable sort of work, because you're raising the entire collective level of consciousness by raising your own level of consciousness. And I think personally, I've noticed from jumps in consciousness or progress in this field that your life can change, your situation will change, your relationships will change, your outlook will change, the amount of happiness you experience, the different challenges you then experience going forward will be different. Like I said, how things become less concrete in what you're actually sort of surrendering to, or the surrendering of. So yeah, the spiritual work changes based on the context as well. So that's also interesting, I found anyway. And I think that's it for this video. I think there's so much more to talk about on this topic, and I've done deep dives in Letting Go if you want to check out that video. And yeah, I think even if you read one of these books, it could probably change your life, but that's just my opinion. So see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Peace. Bye-bye.